I think it was a show of force by the Toronto police. They don't have the courage to stand up to the pro-Hamas mobs on our streets, but boy, they have the courage to arrest a middle-aged Jewish journalist. And they literally did it because I was standing on the public sidewalk. They admitted that I wasn't doing anything. They said that my mere presence there was upsetting to the Hamas extremists, and therefore they were going to arrest me.
That is Ezra Levant speaking to the state of Tel Aviv one day after his arrest on Sunday, November 24th. Toronto police officers, led by Sergeant Jeffrey MacDuff, an experienced veteran who was reported to have been specially trained to manage the post-October 7 demonstrations in the city, decided to arrest Ezra in the middle of a Sunday afternoon in what is usually a quiet, predominantly Jewish neighborhood in the north end of the city, at the intersection of Bathurst and Sheppard Streets. Of course, there's more to the story. This is about something way bigger than Ezra Levant and Rebel News. This is about rampant anti-Semitism in Canada and the tone of the country, which is set at the top in the office of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Anti-Semitism in Canada has not just been an issue since October 7th. As in many countries, there has always been an anti-Semitism issue in Canada. Sometimes more apparent, sometimes less. But in the institutional halls of influence in Ottawa, the seat of the federal government, this culture is deeply entrenched. And the election of Justin Trudeau in October 2015 unleashed it there in Ottawa. And then it rippled out across the country and grew into a tsunami in the ensuing 5 years that he has been in power. Justin Trudeau licensed Jew hatred within government with his so-called progressive policies. There's nothing progressive about them. And the fact that Canada has become a standout cesspool of Jew hatred among Western nations should surprise no one. From day one of the prime ministership of Justin Trudeau, I had a front row seat at the show, serving at the time as the Canadian ambassador to Israel. You can read more about that in the podcast notes, where I've posted 2 pieces addressing the specific topic. One that was published in Superior Journal a year ago, and another which ran in one of the earliest issues of State of Tel Aviv. But now, let's get back to the present and focus on Ezra Levant. Ezra is best known these days as a lawyer who founded Rebel News, a media platform that has become the target of many Canadians. Perhaps his chief nemesis is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau himself, whose office and communications team has barred Rebel News from covering run-of-the-mill political events for years. Rebel is constantly banned from attending government press conferences. They were banned from attending an election debate in which the Prime Minister participated. His office and government have made clear that they regard Rebel as an activist organization and not a legitimate news outlet. I mean, Justin Trudeau and his people can hate on Rebel all they want. But in a serious country, we do not use the cudgel of the law to bully those with whom we do not agree. Quite the contrary. That is precisely why we have constitutional protections and civil rights laws. But Justin Trudeau seems to have skipped his civics classes. Prime Minister Trudeau has been very clear about the contempt in which he holds Rebel News, or anyone, for that matter, who dares to disagree with his government. We saw how his cabinet responded to the peaceful trucker protests in 2022, which garnered international attention. Trudeau and his then right hand, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, were apoplectic over the trucker protest, referring to it as an insurgency funded by foreign agents. That was all poppycock, of course, but they presented it to justify them in invoking the Emergencies Act. which gave the government martial law-like power. And they took this extreme action with unbridled glee and malevolence. They went after the little people. Canadians who had donated $50 to support the trucker protest, which was really about excessively coercive mandates related to and flowing from the government's handling of the pandemic. These people found that overnight they were public enemy number one. Their bank accounts were frozen. Many were debanked. Major Canadian financial institutions severed relations with clients with no notice. When Freeland announced this action, standing at the microphone, she was unable to repress a long giggle. That press conference went viral globally. The world then began to really wake up and pay attention to what was going on in Canada. But it was and continued to get so much worse. This background context is important because it underpins so much of the colossal mess that Canada has become in the last 9 years under the leadership of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Now, back to Ezra and Rebel News and Bathurst and Sheppard. Rebel has an edgy, provocative style. Not all appreciate their approach, but they deliver truths. They refuse to abide the self-censorship that has afflicted most, not all, but most of Canadian media outlets. There are very few exceptions. So, Rebel has become a target. Its reporters can be really in your face. Rebel reporters do not cower before power. But what happened recently in Toronto and Montreal shocked the world. It didn't shock me. And I'm a Canadian Jew, born in Toronto. When I was a little kid, I lived a stone's throw from where Ezra was arrested on Saturday, November 24th. I know that city inside out. Am I disgusted? Yes. Surprised? Not a bit. Today, in part one of this longer form podcast, we go deep into what has happened to Canada and why. Until recently, it was thought to be this idyllic land of the Rockies and beer and bacon and maple syrup and boundless tolerance. Oh, and most importantly for me, flannel shirts, outdoor fire pits, and freshwater lakes, especially in summer. So, what changed? In a name, Justin Trudeau. He had a dream. He told us early on in his tenure that we were the first post-national state, whatever that means. He went on rhapsodically, entrancing besotted journalists, often American, often foreign, about how Canada lacked a core national identity. So he was just going to open the gates and let them all come in. As he tweeted shortly after President Trump, in his first term, imposed harsh entry restrictions into America, Justin stepped in to save the world, announcing on Twitter, "Come one, come all to Canada, where we welcome everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, or religion. Diversity," he loved to intone, "is our strength." That's all lovely, but what Justin did not do is think about the back end, the back office, like how Canada will support and integrate what became a massive influx of so-called asylum seekers and immigrants from all over the world. He saw himself as a figurehead. He did not get into the mechanics of how his grand policy visions would play out. In Justin's bubble, Canada really was the land of unicorns, rainbows, and sunny ways, which was actually a campaign slogan he used in 2015. Sunny ways, my friends. Sunny ways. Today, we are seeing the results of his sunny ways and policy vision, which was all based in nothing but whimsy. The economy is tanking. Crime is surging. Drug addiction is epidemic. Housing is beyond unaffordable. In the Canadian winter, people with good jobs are sleeping in trailers by the side of the road. They are sleeping and living in homeless tent encampments. We have become a tragic parody of what we once were. The innocent, polite, nice darling of the world. And Canada has also become a violently anti-Semitic country. Canadian Jews are being targeted by hateful Islamists and so-called progressives. These are the people to whom Justin and his caucus have pandered in the past, and who support his government. Well, supported. He's learning now that even he may not be ideologically extreme enough for them. So some are turning on the man they now call Genocide Justin. And they're just getting going. So are we at State of Tel Aviv. This podcast is an opening salvo that scratches the surface of the hot mess that Canada has become. Today, we focus on Jewish life under Justin Trudeau. This is just the beginning. We'll be peeling back the layers in the months to come. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, and these days straining to respond with a crisp sentence when people ask me, which they do constantly, what the heck is going on in Canada? Stay with us. In recent months, the world has noticed that Canada is a bad place in which to be Jewish. Like Europe bad, possibly worse. On December 11th, a long-form essay written by my friend and iconic Canadian journalist, Terry Glavin, was published in the Free Press, offering an expansive look at aspects of antisemitism in Canada. Of course, I spoke with Terry about his piece, and my interview with him is included in this podcast. On Sunday, November 24th, at a quiet intersection in Toronto, Bathurst St and Sheppard Avenue, a most extraordinary series of events went down. What Ezra Levant has since dubbed the Battle for Bathurst. I love it. Anyone who has ever visited Toronto will know that Bathurst St, a major north-south artery, also doubles as the central nervous system for the Toronto Jewish community. So many neighborhoods with large Jewish populations, schools, community centers, shopping plazas, in short, the stuff of life, lines and radiates out from Bathurst St. Since October 7th, on a weekly basis, members of the Toronto Jewish community, which is upwards of 200,000 people, and their supporters, have assembled at Sheppard Plaza, a classic 1950s-era suburban strip plaza with loads of parking. The development is situated on private property, and the supporters of the community and Israel congregate there weekly with the permission of the plaza owner. Throughout the decades, Sheppard Plaza has remained a shopping hub for Jewish neighborhoods in the north end of the city. In recent months, the Islamists have decided to show up. They come every week with their flags and bullhorns and signs and taunts. They yell at the elderly, children, women, men, whoever happens to be out and about. One older man was physically assaulted a few months ago. The police, as always, did nothing. Immediately following Ezra's arrest, that Sunday and the following Monday and Tuesday, November 24th through 26th, I interviewed various people who provided valuable testimony of the event itself and the general environment in Toronto for Jewish Canadians. In addition to Ezra, I spoke with his lawyer, Leora Shemesh, one of Canada's top criminal defense attorneys, and Karim Assad, also a lawyer who doubles as a chronicler of the protest mania in Canada. Each of these individuals brings deep experience, insight, and differing perspectives to the cauldron that Canada has become. As well, almost 3 weeks after the arrest of Ezra Levant, I spoke with Brian Lilly, a Canadian journalist with decades of experience, who has been one of the few covering these issues consistently and critically, as all media should do. And of course, I had a chat with Terry Glavin on the same day, as it turned out. These interviews will be published in part 2 of this long podcast. It is important to note as well that State of Tel Aviv reached out to Ontario Solicitor General Michael Kersner for comment. His office did not respond to our request. We did engage with some back and forth with the Toronto Police in response to our request to interview Police Chief Myron Demkew. He declined politely. More on that in part 2 of this podcast as well. Now, we begin our interview, finally, with Ezra Levant. It was recorded on November 25th, the day after his arrest for breaching the peace. Have a look at the photograph of Ezra in the podcast notes, showing him being frog-marched by Toronto police officers, handcuffed and detained, while surrounded by pro-Hamas thugs, shouting all manner of Jew-hating slogans. Ezra Levant doing the perp walk. This is Canada Today. Ezra Levant, so good to see you. Free, out of
It's
jail.
good to see anybody.
Healthy. Great.
I'm not looking through a bunch of bars. I've never been in jail as a prisoner before. I've visited people in prison. But, it was frustrating. I think it was a show of force by the Toronto police. They don't have the courage to stand up to the pro-Hamas mobs on our streets. But boy, they have the courage to arrest a middle-aged Jewish journalist. And they literally did it because I was standing on the public sidewalk. They admitted that I wasn't doing anything. They said that my mere presence there was upsetting to the Hamas extremists, and therefore they were going to arrest me. But that's my neighborhood. I actually live in that North Toronto neighborhood. That's the shopping mall I go to, my grocery store. These Hamas extremists are bussed in from the other side of town to terrorize the Jews. And I think they must be laughing every day that the cops act as their concierge. I was handcuffed. Why? Was I a threat to someone? Or did they think I was going to go, blow something up? That's the other side's MO. And they put me in a police car and they put me in jail for a couple hours as a way of saying, don't you think that you can go on our streets without our permission, and we give you permission based on what Hamas says. It's really an astonishing thing to happen to Toronto. And there's a lot of people to blame, from the woke police chief to the anti-Semitic mayor to the fact that we've brought in millions of people to this country who don't share our values. We're not vetted. And they've brought anti-Semitism with them, and the politicians understand which way the wind is blowing. There are many Muslims who are not anti-Semitic, but when you bring in 2 million Muslims in short order without emphasizing integration or Western liberal values, you're going to politically drown out the 400,000 Jews in this country. And whether it's Mississauga's Mayor Carolyn Parrish or Toronto's Mayor Olivia Chow or Melanie Joly talking about the demographics in her own riding, Canadian politicians, Canadian police are now aligning themselves with anti-Semitism. I don't think that Myron Demkew, the police chief of Toronto, is himself an anti-Semite. I think he just sees who's on the streets and hears what his masters say. And he's saying, oh, that's how it is now.
Yeah, I think that actually the tone is set at the top. The responsibility for this, what I now think is a national security crisis, right at the feet of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, has been very pro-Islamist from day one of his tenure. And he's become bolder and bolder, and particularly since October 7th. There's no ambiguity there. And then, over the years, as you quite rightly say, I don't know if the figure is 2 million. Not every Muslim is an Islamist, but we certainly have more than our fair share in Canada. And we don't seem to have the political will at any level of government to deal with this. But let's go back to yesterday. I was watching almost in real time, and I was shocked, and I don't have high expectations these days for Toronto police and watching what's going on there. We had these riots on Friday night in Montreal that made international headlines, alongside the video footage of our Prime Minister dancing with teenage girls and exchanging Swiftie bracelets while this is going on. And then the next day, middle-aged Ezra Levant at Sheppard Plaza, you walked across the street. I understand there are two zones. There's the sort of pro-Israel zone on one side of Bathurst, and there's the pro-Hamas side on the other. And yesterday was quite a spectacle because There were about 30 or so pro-Hamasniks. They came with furniture, an armchair that was complete with, mock bloodstains, and some fellow who I think is well known and came in to sit in the chair and play Yahya Sinwar in his final moments, throwing pieces of wood. You went over as a journalist to film this spectacle and to talk to them. Tell us what happened then.
I didn't go to talk to them. They have nothing to say. There's two Naturae Carta extremists, pro-Iranian Jewish cultists who are there every week denouncing the Jews. There's no point talking to them. You have these Iranian operatives who run this, and there's no point talking to them. So I did not, in fact, go to talk to them. I went to simply take a photograph of this grotesque display. I mean, it's truly astonishing what they set up there, that sort of reenactment of Yahya Sinwar. It would be like having someone reenact Hitler in the bunker. Or, for another example, if the KKK were burning a cross outside a black church. And, the KKK wore masks, and many of these Hamas protesters wear masks. And they're doing this in a residential area. There's no embassy or consulate nearby. There's no political target. There's Jewish targets. So I went to photograph this grotesque display because, I'm not a big believer in so-called hate crimes. I believe in crimes, uttering death threats, mischief, trespass. There's a lot of reasons to arrest these terrorist supporters that don't have anything to do with free speech. But the cops say they believe in hate crimes, but they were abiding this. So I went to take photos of it. It was the police who pushed me away, not the Hamas thugs. And they pushed me far away so I couldn't take photos. And then they said, you have to stand down the block down there in a media area. I said, Canada is my media area. I don't take my editing decisions from the Toronto Police. The news is over there. At this point, I was standing well away from this grotesque display. I was surrounded by cops. And the boss cop, MacDuff is his name, we just basically argued for a bit. And I made the mistake of questioning his authority. At one point, he said, I am the law. I said, no, you're not. You're a servant of the law. And he said, you're inciting them. I said, no, I'm not. I'm not interacting with them at all. The only thing that was inciting them was the fact that they know I'm a Jew. And they said so. When I interacted with them a week ago, they were saying, go back to Poland, Intifada, final solution. So all their comments were Jewish oriented. So basically, let me sum up. In my own neighborhood, where I'm a citizen and a taxpayer and a neighbor, I was told I cannot go on the public sidewalk with my camera to take a photo of an anti-Semitic hate incident. And my mere presence, because I'm Jewish, is enough to make my presence illegal. And the police, following the path of least resistance, will arrest me, not those who would get excitable and violent over my presence. So a disastrous day for the rule of law, the police murdering their own reputation. Toronto police have presided over the worst crime wave in history, a regular crime wave, and then an anti-Semitic crime wave on top of that. There's so many anti-Semitic crimes in Toronto that they try not to report them all. There was an arson attack on a large Jewish school that they said, no, it was a shed that was burnt accidentally. What are you talking about? It was an arson attack. There was an arson attack on a Jewish school bus. They just said the school bus was ablaze or something, like it was spontaneous combustion.
Right.
There was shootings at a Jewish day school. The Toronto cop went to great lengths to avoid the word anti-Semitism or hate crime. In fact, the Toronto cop said, don't share the security footage. I've never heard of people saying don't share footage of a crime before. The Toronto police, I don't believe that the rank and file are anti-Semitic. I don't believe they are. But from the top down, they are woke. And by the way, it's not just on the police chief, and it's not just on the mayor, and it's not just on the prime minister. Doug Ford is the premier of Ontario. It's within his power to regulate police. And the Solicitor General, the minister in charge of police, is a Jew. And I think that's deliberate because he has declined to prosecute these hate mobs. And you can't really say, well, you're anti-Semitic or you're black. Oh, no, I'm a Jew myself. I even wear a yarmulke. No, hey, did I tell you I'm super Jewish? Thanks, brother. I don't give a damn about your personal religion. Can you please do your job as Solicitor General? He is presiding over the crime wave. Why are protests that vandalize and that threaten Why are those abided? And why has my reporter, David Menzies, been arrested 5 times in 2024 for covering these things? So my arrest yesterday was my first time in my life being arrested, but it's actually the 6th time in the last 11 months that a Rebel News journalist has been arrested.
When Sergeant Jeffrey, I am the law MacDuff, escorted you in handcuffs to the police car, was he then in the car that transported you to the station?
He did not escort me to the car. He handed me off to 2 young cops who took me to the car, handcuffed me, searched me, emptied my pockets, put me in the car, took me to the police station and booked me in. So the 2 cops in the car were young cops who were completely apolitical. And I realized that immediately. These were not the people who made the decision. They were just the youngsters who were told what to do. So I really had no quarrel with them.
So they take you to the station, they book you, you spend a couple of hours cooling off in the clink. Were you charged with anything?
No, and there was nothing to charge me with. And breaching the peace, that's not even in the criminal code, by the way. This was a purely political act to scoop me off the street. And if you look at where I was when I was arrested, I wasn't actually even near this grotesque Hamas display. I had been fraud marched away from there by another cop and then let go. So I had already been removed from the area that they were protecting, their safe zone for the Hamas people. It was because I dared to challenge that top cop, MacDuff. Boy, he was quick to arrest me when I challenged him. And he said, I'm the law. I said, no, you're not. You're a servant of the law. Arrest this man. He's clearly a bully and no one stands up to him. And he, with the flick of his wrist, he has me arrested, humiliated, handcuffed, searched, and jailed for a few hours. Well, I think he needs to be told by a judge that what he's doing is wrong. It's against the law. There was actually a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada called Fleming versus Ontario. Couldn't be closer in parallel to this. It was a conservative protester, if I'm not mistaken, and a group of people were trotting up to him, and they arrested the guy rather than those who were threatening the disturbance. And the Supreme Court said you cannot arrest an innocent person because other people may cause a disturbance with their president. The case is startlingly on point, or on all fours, as lawyers would say. So I think the world has gone mad, but I think help is on the way. I think Donald Trump's victory is going to reset normal conduct in the West, going to call out terrorism. And you can already see the salutary effects of that. I think America's back and they're going to reassert themselves in a lot of ways. And I think Pierre Poilievre is quite likely to win the next election in Canada and realign us into normalcy. But that still doesn't deal with the massive problem Canada has.
Massive.
If anyone is for mass immigration, that's the problem. And you have to be against immigration. You have to be for deportation of foreign nationals who participate in these hate marches. If you still believe in immigration in 2024, you have a suicide gene in you. And I don't want to be near you when the Hamas bombs go off.
Immigration is one thing, uncontrolled, and immigration from dangerous parts of the world with no security screening is quite another. Let me ask you, Ezra, just before we finish, because I know you got a lot of people who want your time today, and I'm glad you made time for State of Tel Aviv. I'm assuming that Chief of Police, the Mayor, the Solicitor General, you haven't heard from anyone with respect to what transpired yesterday.
No, not only have I not heard from them, I haven't heard from the Canadian Association of Journalists, Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, Canadian Civil Liberties Association, PEN Canada, Amnesty International, Canadian Institute for Israel and Jewish Affairs. None of the official people who's supposed to care about journalistic freedom, or frankly about the Jews, none of the official Jews, not a word to say. There's still, the Jewish community just had a gala for the police chief of Toronto. The worst anti-Semitic crime wave in Canadian history. The worst crime wave in Canadian history. And the Jews are having a celebration of this man. I mean, shake your head.
Keep up the good fight, and let that be your first and last arrest.
Thanks very much. Good to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Ezra. Really appreciate it.
This is as good a time as any to interrupt to thank you all for listening. This podcast episode is long, and there's a lot to take in. Perfect weekend listening. There are 3 interviews featured in this episode, with a healthy dose of my commentary and narration. Perhaps split it up. And for our listeners who are enjoying our work, maybe today is the day when you take the plunge and upgrade to a paid subscription. We need the financial support to produce this content. It is labor intensive and we are truly independent. Thank you for being here, and I really appreciate you considering this request. And to those who have already been supporting us for some time, thank you so much. We couldn't do without you. Now, back to the podcast. On the day of Ezra's arrest, I also caught up with Leora Shemesh, a force of nature, who, as I mentioned earlier, also happens to be one of Canada's top criminal defense lawyers. Leora has become very involved in stepping up for journalists and others who seem to have become the focus of law enforcement wrath in this strange new version of Toronto in which we find ourselves living. She had been at Bathurst and Sheppard earlier that day, on the Sunday, and in the middle of our conversation, we were speaking on Sunday just after Ezra had been arrested, she received a call from Ezra letting her know that he'd been released by the police. No charges, just the very theatrical show of force, and, in my view, exceedingly poor judgment on the part of Toronto police. Having said that, as we will hear from Leora, this approach to managing Islamist extremists and so-called progressives who are openly inciting hatred on the streets of Toronto is, sadly, typical. Here's Leora.
10:30 at night on Sunday, November 24th, which makes it 3:30 in the afternoon in Toronto, where you are, Leora Shemesh. Thank you so much for joining State of Tel Aviv today.
Thank you for having me.
Leora, describe what was going on at Bathurst and Sheppard this week.
So just to give you some insight, at Bathurst and Sheppard, they've been there for 60 some odd weeks. And for I would say the first 56 of them or so, they did it. They were there with their flags and their songs and their Israeli flags and their really love and support for Israel, oftentimes bringing awareness to the hostages.
So when you say they've been there for the last 60 weeks, you're meaning people who support Israel, who support the Jewish community.
And they did it with the blessing of the owner of the plaza where we are situated, and really with no police officer presence. There was no need for police officer presence. And then a number of weeks ago, the pro-Palestinian supporters began to appear, and the agitators began to appear, and the horrible, hateful, disgusting vitriol that is occurring on our downtown streets have now made their way up to the Jewish community. They've placed themselves across the street from the Jewish supporters, and they continue to really harass and intimidate. They're often flying Hamas flags, Hezbollah flags, inverted triangles, slogans calling for the death of Jews. I mean, the slogans are horrific and truly do encompass all the trappings of hate speech. And so the police began to appear really to ensure that no assaultive behavior was taking place. But oftentimes the hate speech would go, really unenforced. In fact, I can't remember a time where anyone on the other side, and when I say the other side, the pro-Palestinian side, was being arrested or charged. But on our side, people were. And I don't know if you know this about me, but I have become really the lawyer for those who get charged in protests. I've been representing all of those people pro bono and taking care of them as best as possible. So oftentimes I don't appear at these protests because I don't want to be conflicted out. And so I stay at home, I get updates, I get photos, I get phone calls, and I wait, hoping that no one will be charged. But oftentimes people do get charged, and then I represent them.
Did they take the initiative to go across the street on Bathurst, or did the cops?
The police separated all of us, and they now have a very large presence there, these officers, and they stand sort of on the sidewalk. They don't allow people on either side to cross. In other words, if you're a Jewish supporter, you need to remain on that side of the street. If you're a pro-Palestinian supporter, it's very Canadian, right? You need to stay on that side of the street, and everybody is hoping to get along, so to speak, with the presence of police being clearly noted. But today I got a call this morning that bylaw enforcement was coming down because what's been happening is there's been a competition of who has the louder speakers. So on the pro-Israel side, we've got the, Jewish Omer Adams songs being played. And on the other side, we've got God knows what being played in Arabic, likely calling for our death, God knows what, and them chanting into the microphone that pierces your eardrum. And so there's buildings, as you know, behind them and people that live there that are obviously making complaints now. They didn't make the complaints the 52 some odd weeks earlier, but they're making the complaints now because they have this horrific noise coming from the pro-Palestinian side, which is clearly calling for the deaths of Jews. And so they brought down...
that. Do you know that for a fact?
No, I do know that for a fact. Yeah, that is why the bylaw enforcement officers were called down, is because there's been so many complaints.
They're speaking in Arabic or in English calling for the death?
No, the ones who are speaking in English are calling for our deaths. Yes.
What are they saying?
Final solution. There's only one solution. Final solution. That was today when I got there. For about 5 or 6 minutes when I was there, she must have repeated it 15 times before I tapped the officer on the shoulder and said, do you want to do anything about this? Do you think this might fall under hate speech? And he said, no, I don't think it does. So, they're obviously bringing out the bottom of the barrel of police officers who really either A, have no education or no understanding of the law, or clearly just don't want to enforce it. Either or, the other side is being permitted to continue to holler into their megaphones for the death of Jews. Never mind their large displays of banners that say that Israel needs to be eliminated, that there's no place for Israel. They have the Jewish or the Israeli flag on the ground, which they're stepping on. Today, they hauled in their furniture from their homes, I suppose. And they had a man dressed up as Yahya Sinwar, had him sit on a chair with it blood-soaked, and were sort of reenacting Sinwar's last moments while, everyone around him were memorializing him. And this is thanks to our Mississauga mayor, who felt that it was appropriate to compare Yahya Sinwar to Nelson Mandela, and really, I say, champion this as him being some sort of peaceful activist.
Leora is referring here to Carolyn Parrish, the mayor of Mississauga, a city of approximately 750,000 people adjacent to Toronto and with a heavily Muslim population. There are also many newcomers to Canada living in the city. Mayor Parrish supported a memorial ceremony on civic property honoring Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, and she further compared him to Nelson Mandela, saying at a city council meeting in November, "I just want to point out," she said, "and I'm not being facetious, Nelson Mandela was declared a terrorist by the United States of America until the year 2008. Your terrorist and somebody else's terrorist may be two different things." What Mayor Parrish did not remind those assembled in November was her statement on social media in January 2015, where she posted this comment on Twitter, quote, "I don't get into discussions with Zionists. Have tried in past and found it a fruitless exercise. Been to Palestine. Know what's up." Closed quote. The Hamas vigil for Sinwar, needless to say, went ahead. Now, back to Leora Shemish.
And so we're broken here in Canada, and we continue to be broken. And when I think we can't deteriorate anymore, we do. I am surprised that we are able to get worse every single week. We have a prime minister who is at, a concert braiding bracelets with other Swifties while Montreal is being set ablaze. So I don't know what to tell you other than to say we have no leadership. Everyone is asleep. There's no one home. I don't know why that is, but we have become a lawless country where we have people on our streets who are just getting wilder by the moment, and Toronto is holding its breath that we don't become the next Montreal.
Many people listening today are not Canadians. So let me just give you a real 101 crash course. We have 3 levels of legal jurisdiction in Canada. We have the federal, which is the government of Canada. We have the provinces and territories. There are 13 of those. And then we have municipal/city. And what Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, has been doing since October 7th, when riotous celebrations broke out in many cities in Canada, celebrating the savage murder of Israelis while it was still going on. And from October 7th until very recently, Justin Trudeau kept saying 2 things. One, these are peaceful protests and they're just exercising their constitutional rights, which you and I both know is BS through and
Absolutely.
through. There was nothing peaceful, and there are no constitutional protections for that kind of hate speech. And with respect to the violence, this has been going on since October 2023. Jewish businesses have been vandalized and targeted. Jewish patrons of these businesses have been threatened and intimidated. There have been Molotov cocktails and firebombs thrown at Jewish schools in Montreal and Toronto. A Jewish school has been shot up in Toronto on a number of occasions. We could go on and on, but there's a really long list of appalling crimes. And one of the reasons I think that Americans probably don't know more about it and the world doesn't know more about it is because it's Canada. Because Canada just never makes the top of the news, right? And it takes a crisis for people to pay attention. So that's kind of been going on for, and there's also, this habit, these demonstrations in the downtown cores of Toronto and Montreal in particular, where these Islamists set up pop-up mosques, for lack of a better term.
They're literally praying on the streets of the downtown core.
On the filthy streets of the downtown core. They block public transport, transit, they block the streets, and the police stand there and allow them to do this. I mean, it is truly, they have taken over and there's no law enforcement. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, says peaceful protest, constitutional rights, and then his third basis for saying nothing I can do is always, well, it's really the responsibility of the cities. It's for the police officers and they're controlled by the municipalities. So I'm just the Prime Minister of Canada. Like, if people are rioting in the streets and chasing Jews and bombing schools and synagogues, nothing I can do about it. I got to go to a Taylor Swift concert, right? And my response to that, and I want to know what you think, is number one, this is now a national security crisis.
Absolutely. If there was ever a time to talk about the Emergency Act, maybe now is the time. Rather than worrying about those truckers who are honking their horns in the downtown Ottawa core, maybe he can start paying attention to the fact that Jewish children don't feel safe going to school. Maybe he should start actually paying attention to the people on our streets that are calling for the death of Jewish people. Those are the things that should really be causing him some concern and keeping him up at night, not the Freedom Convoy people who are saying, F Trudeau through slogans and signs on their trucks. So, yeah, I think this isn't necessarily affecting Justin Trudeau. When the Freedom Convoy did, he was taking it quite personally. That was the time that he thought he should call in the police to sort of take care of things. It won't just end at the Jewish community. It will end by Islamists and radical Islamists taking over Western civilization. So that next are the Christians and everybody else in between. So, yeah, it's frightening to say the least, that the law is not being used at the appropriate time. And this is the appropriate time. And quite frankly, when I was there today trying to educate police officers on the ground about why and how this was hate speech, I was met with people who were dumbfounded, looking at me like I came from outer space. There's got to be at least 30 officers at the plaza today whose only job is to make sure that fists aren't thrown and that knives and guns aren't pulled. But aside from that, they operate in no other way. So they're not actually enforcing any hate speech laws. They're not actually taking note of the people across the street who are calling for our death. That doesn't seem to be a concern to them. But what was of concern to them today was poor Ezra Levant, who is a journalist, who is part of the press, trying to cover what is going on in Canada so he can broadcast it for the world to see. He's arrested because you know why? He's on the wrong side of the street. And because he's on the wrong side of the street, he is breaching the peace. Calling for my death and dressing up as Sinwar is not breaching any peace. But him being on the wrong side of the street somehow breached the peace today. So he was called down to 32 Division, which is a police station here in Toronto. And I was able to speak to him, and he is being released momentarily, again, with no charges. Same thing they did to David Menzies. I'm appalled today as to what I'm seeing around me. And I speak at conferences trying to educate, young people about what hate speech is and what we should be expecting and how the law and the justice system should provide us some comfort. It doesn't, and it isn't. So we've become a lawless society where it feels often days like we're in the jungle. And it's really, hoping that we can all survive at this point. It's really that bad. I know I'm making it sound bad, but it really is a lot worse.
So the message to Jewish people in Canada, because it does go beyond Toronto and Montreal, is, oh, well.
You're not welcome. That's what it feels like. Right. So I have an Israeli father, and I can tell you that 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, my father was saying best country in the world. Coming from an Israeli, he said, best country in the world. You talk to my dad today, he can't even speak. We do not recognize the country around us anymore. We are not welcome here, and it certainly feels that way. And I know people joke about, leaving and moving to Florida or going back to Israel. The truth of the matter is, I think anywhere is better than here at the moment. It is that bad. And the truth is, we continue to have to fight for our place here in Canada. And it's frightening, more so for the younger people who are really trying to make it through university and start careers. It's been very difficult on them. They don't feel comfortable enough to have a voice in certain places and facets of our society, which I understand. And so we, lawyers, doctors, professionals, parents, we're all taking up the fight for them. And it's exhausting. I'm not going to lie. It's exhausting because we all have other chores and careers and jobs and families. And in addition to, what we're doing on in our everyday lives, we're having to take on a fight that one wouldn't have thought we would have to fight for anymore.
Canada has the fourth largest Jewish community in the world after Israel, the United States, France. The numbers are usually said to be about 375,000. And somewhere between 200 and 250,000 in the Toronto area. It's a city where there is a large cohort of Jewish people. They've been there for generations. Your office is downtown. My office used to be downtown. We're assimilated and we're well integrated. When you say that the police officers kind of look at you blankly when you start trying to engage them with respect to hate speech, and they are being sent to that location, which is like, that's the issue. Mm-hmm. Honestly, I'm shocked.
Don't be. I mean, I just think it's easier to attack the Jewish community and arrest those on the Jewish side than it is on the pro-Palestinian side, which tend to be far more violent in nature. They're fully covered. If you saw them, you would think that you are looking at pictures of Hamas terrorists in Gaza. That's how they are dressed. They are fully covered from head to toe. You can't even see their eyes. They showed up today with masks on, what looked to be like Halloween scream masks. They've now taken to covering themselves entirely because what's been happening is we've been trying to identify many of these people, and we've been successful in doing so and finding out where they worked and where they are, and we've been outing them on social media and other platforms so that people know who they are. We're trying to unmask the hate so that people know that these people are integrated in our society, are walking amongst us, that this isn't just a weekend job, but they are holding these ideas and ideologies as they are working amongst us and walking and living amongst us. So we're trying to unmask them. And so they're showing up with better masks now every weekend. And that seems to not cause the police any concern. That too is a criminal offense in the criminal code, that if you are masked and you are inciting violence, that in and of itself is a crime punishable under the criminal code. And again, it's not being enforced. But you know what was enforced today? Ezra Levant walking on the other side of the street. And so when officers get to decide, who they're going to charge, and we're looking across the street and saying, exhibit A, B, and C, and D are right in front of your eyes, the only rational reason that I can understand why they aren't charging is, as I said, either they don't understand the law or they don't care. It's one or the other.
Well, there's a third option, Leora, which is that they're anti-Semitic.
Yes. I mean, that very well could be true. I'm hoping to God that all 30 or 40 officers that were present today aren't all anti-Semitic, that they are probably trying to choose the easiest way to get out of, the Bathurst and Sheppard Plaza, without any harm to themselves. And I'm telling you, I think it is because the other side is incredibly aggressive and violent. Their speech is violent. They're angry. You can see the very clear difference on the two sides of the street. On one side of the street, you have people waving Israeli flags and singing and dancing and doing horas. And on the other side of the street, you have them calling for the death of Jews and dressing up as Yahya Sinwar. So, if you're a police officer, which side of the street do you want to be on? I'm sure they're flipping a coin at the start of their shift and saying, I want the blue and white side, and you take the Sinwar side. So...
But on the blue and white side, they're also waving Canadian flags as well.
They are.
And there are no Canadian flags on the Sinwar side.
Oh, absolutely not. They're far more angrier on the other side. And we really do try very hard. There are people who do come on our side who are emotionally charged, that want to react and respond. And we have people on our side who are walking around trying to calm people down and just say, leave it alone. And we do. So as I said, watching it, standing back and watching it, it has become a specimen of how Canada is now, how it's pictured. So when I looked at the street today, I realized this is what we've been living like for the last God knows how many months, is the separation of, good and evil, dark and light, and officers who are smack dab in the middle, really just trying to hold the two sides without actually enforcing the law. And what that is doing is it's normalizing the speech, and it's normalizing the behavior. And many people are now saying that we are days or hours away from Montreal, from the scenes of Montreal. Montreal was literally set ablaze with Heil Hitler salutes and Nazi salutes by people who were walking up and down the streets. So, yeah, I think we're moments away from that. We're close. Smashing of windows and burning of cars, and we're moments away.
I'm sure our listeners will be wondering, where has the organized Jewish community been in all of this since October 7th, 2023?
The horrendous thing about our community, which will be no surprise to your listeners, is that we are never unified. It is so unfortunate that everybody wants a pat on the back and everybody wants to be the spokesperson for the Jewish community. And rather than be unified and powerful and strong in numbers, we divide and conquer, and we don't even conquer. We try to divide and conquer individually as opposed to cumulatively, which is really unfortunate. There's probably too many people doing too many different things when we don't have one single message and one single simplistic message, which is we need enforcement, we need law enforcement, and we need action on the part of government and leadership. And that should be our unified message from all organizations all the time, every day. And I don't believe we have that. We have fractured messaging from different organizations. We need all hands on deck. And I don't believe we have that right now. We don't.
It's unfortunate, particularly with respect to security, which I would think, people may have different views on political issues and perhaps how the community should present itself. But security, physical security and safety, I just don't see any sort of variations or hues in that. I would have thought by now we would see a groundswell of support from other Canadians. Now, Canadians are notoriously passive, deferential, put your head down, it'll pass. Very different culture from America. But I mean, there are very few voices. Just recently, there have been General Rick Hillier and a few others that have started to speak out. But we're way past the speaking stage. We need shows of strength and support and power.
I feel like everything is an argument and everything is a struggle. And Canada didn't feel that way. It was, as you know, quite a multicultural country. The fabric of Canada really was a mosaic. And we loved that about the country. And you would not recognize it anymore. It is not the same country. The lack of leadership is astounding. And it's not just lack of leadership from Justin Trudeau. I'm talking about lack of leadership in unions, in school officials, in administrators, in principals, right down to the hockey coach. The lack of leadership in this country is appalling.
I agree. My view is that there has been a definite tone set from the top, and that's Prime Minister down. So, when you say at the very top of the pyramid, these are peaceful protests and they're exercising their constitutional rights, it really, makes it difficult for the provinces or the municipalities to step out and take a different position. So the vision from the top has trickled down.
There's no irony or coincidence in the fact that following Justin Trudeau's position, very vocal position about, dealing with the arrest warrants for Bibi Netanyahu and Galan, following that, almost immediately following that, Montreal was set ablaze. And so his perpetuation of all of this is very clear. And even the words that he does choose to speak is just causing this situation to get worse and to unravel to a degree that I didn't think we could get to. So as I say, just when I think it can't get any worse, it does.
I have to say, when I saw the reactions of all of the European leaders, who of course are in tougher situations with respect to the ICC because they have their national issues and then they have the EU. There was not a single, actually, EU leader who came out as unequivocally and strongly as Justin Trudeau. Macron hedged, the German Chancellor hedged, and Foreign Minister. I could on and on. And it's not as though the EU members are so friendly to Israel. And so everybody is looking at Justin Trudeau now. It's like, what the heck is going on there? And you're quite right. That was on Thursday. I said to my kids, you watch, something's going to blow up this week. And sure enough, less than 24 hours later, Montreal blows up. Justin ignores it. And here we are, not even 48 hours later. So I suppose we have to, there's an old Broadway song, hope for the best, prepare for the worst, something like that. And thank you for all your efforts and for all you do, Leora.
Take good care of yourself.
Two days after Ezra Levant's arrest, Karima Saad spoke with State of Tel Aviv about the incident at Bathurst and Sheppard, but also about the general atmosphere in Toronto when it comes to pro-Israel demonstrators and Toronto police. And, in contrast, how the police interact with the Islamists and progressives. There is nothing, absolutely nothing progressive about these groups that march in comradeship with Islamists. Nothing. Karima is doing important work in Toronto and elsewhere, and I thought it best to have her explain who she is and what she does. Over to Karima.
Tuesday, November 26th. It's about 7:30 in the evening in Israel, which makes it 12:30 in Toronto, where Karima Saad is waiting to talk to State of Tel Aviv. Thank you so much for joining us, Karima.
Thank you for having me.
So we were just having a brief chat earlier, and it's no secret that I'm a big and longtime fan of your work. And rather than me explain what you do and who you are, why don't you tell our listeners, because you're going to be new to people who aren't from Toronto.
Thank you. So my name is Karima, and I am a lawyer and a journalist. And I focus particularly on covering the Canadian protest circuit and hate industry. And that means that I have had occasion to attend all types of protests, primarily in Ontario, focused on a variety of issues. And my purpose in documenting protests isn't so much to address or weigh in on the underlying causes that protesters are trying to express themselves about, but rather to document and consider the tactics, styles of messaging, and interactions between protesters, sometimes counter-protesters, bystanders, police, politicians, really trying to understand what is happening with all of the discontent on Canadian streets.
How long have you been doing this for?
I've been doing the protest circuit documentation since the end of 2020, beginning of 2021. It kind of came out of the anti-mandate protests during the COVID lockdowns, and obviously then there were mask mandates, vaccine mandates. It evolved to the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. And from there, the focus sort of shifted to gender ideology, gender critical protests. And then since October of last year, one of the most common types of demonstration pertain to Israel and Palestine.
So just for our listeners who may not be familiar with the Freedom Convoy that Karima refers to, that, of course, is known, I think, globally more as the Trucker Convoy. And so you were covering that. We had a lot of discontent in Canada, and you're based in Toronto, right? Okay, so you get a lot of action there. So what I really want to get into with you today, Karima, is what went on in Toronto on Sunday. And I have spoken with Ezra Levant. I have spoken with his lawyer, Leora Shemish. What did you see, or how did you learn about what transpired on Sunday afternoon at Bathurst and Sheppard in Toronto?
Sure. So for the past 2 months, there have been counter-protesters and rally-goers at Bathurst and Sheppard, which is a departure from the year prior, where we only had a pro-Israel rally and there was no real opposition to that. So the past 2 months have been a little more contentious.
Karima's videographer was assigned to attend the gathering at Bathurst and Sheppard and record events as he saw them. In our conversation, Karima continued to describe the stage set, which you've already heard about from others. She then gets into the other relevant stuff.
Now, I guess it's important to provide some context to the relationship between Rebel News and Toronto Police, because over the course of the past year, I would say, it has become an increasingly antagonistic relationship. David Menzies is a Rebel News correspondent. He's been arrested multiple times at different sorts of demonstrations. And on one occasion, not even a demonstration, he was trying to ask the Deputy Prime Minister questions and was roughed up and arrested as a result of that. I understand that there are pending civil lawsuits about the treatment of David and it seems now of Ezra in relation to Toronto Police. Rebel News has this electronic billboard truck, and one set of messaging pertains to Toronto Police, shaming Toronto Police for the ways that they have interacted not only with Rebel News, but also in relation to protesters. There is tension, right? If we put it lightly, there's tension. Now, 2 weeks ago at Bathurst and Sheppard, David Menzies was arrested for basically going over to counter-protesters, and it attracted kind of a swarm of counter-protesters who tried pushing him back. And rather than addressing that, police tried removing David from the area, and when he resisted that, he was arrested, he was handcuffed, and it sounds like the handcuffs were put on too tight and ultimately had to be removed by the fire department many hours later. And to my understanding, he was not charged following that incident. It was for breach of the peace. This week, I believe there was Ezra and David and maybe Ephraim Monsanto who was with them. And we did see Ezra get arrested as he did the same thing as David a couple of weeks prior, crossed over to where the counter protesters were. I believe he was trying to get clearer photos of the Sinwar reenactment that I was describing. And police, they told him to leave that area. He insisted on his right to be there, and he was arrested for breach of the peace. So, there is this history behind what has happened. The same duty inspector, staff sergeant who oversaw Ezra's arrest this Sunday was the one who was there a couple of weeks ago when it was David being arrested. He generally has limited patience, I would say, for anyone who isn't complying with his orders. And he sort of says, if you don't do this, then that, and follows through. And I've seen him arrest, people who are demonstrating in support of Palestine. I've seen him arrest people who are demonstrating in support of Israel. And it's really just across the board. If you aren't following those directives and you happen to be caught up in his line of sight, you could end up in cuffs.
It seems that Sergeant MacDuff has a temper, which is triggered by Rebel News personnel. But he is not, for some reason, triggered by Islamist demonstrators. Note the photograph in the notes of Sergeant MacDuff sharing a hearty laugh with one of the pro-Hamas attendees on Sunday, November 24th at Bathurst and Sheppard, before the event really got going. Sergeant MacDuff is laughing it up with a man known to regularly organize pro-Hamas demonstrations in the Toronto area. The photo speaks for itself. So there are the visuals. There are the patterns of behavior. And then there are the spoken words and chants. And of course, the signs held aloft by the pro-Hamas group. Karima and I do not see eye to eye on this last bit. Karima takes the view that when they're calling for a final solution, that's pretty clearly related to the mass murder of Jews. But chants like, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, or Intifada revolution, there is only one solution, etc., to her, those are a little less clear and more problematic. Unlike Karima, I see no such nuance in the speech. I understand it to be calling very clearly for the annihilation of the Jewish state, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. How else could one interpret that? Canadian journalist Brian Lilly, who we will hear from in part 2 of this podcast series, agrees with how I see things. Karima says she finds such interpretations problematic and has attended numerous town halls where the meaning of from the river to the sea is parsed and by no means agreed upon. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Intifada revolution. There is only one solution. A final solution. Etc. So I disagree strongly and stridently with Karima on this point. Any perceived ambiguity in the meaning of any of those phrases is a forced interpretation. And in my opinion, it is divorced from the overall context. Never mind the plain meaning of the words themselves.
You don't have the right to come into a neighborhood and target people with hateful acts and hateful slogans. I think it's disingenuous to kind of strip the content from where they're doing it. And they're there week after week. If you step back, you don't have to be Jewish. Anyone, and people around the world are looking at Canada now and saying, what the heck is going on? You've got a Yahya Sinwar guy sitting in a chair, throwing sticks, masked. You've got these quite ugly signs, people holding signs around him. in a Jewish neighborhood. And a guy who, I don't care if you like Rebel News or you hate it, if you like the way they cover things or hate it, that's not the issue. We also have a constitutional protection for freedom of the press, in theory. So, there are many journalists who I think are terrible at their jobs, but I would never take the position that they should be arrested. People may find Ezra and Rebel all kinds of things. I just want to say that when I watch those tapes and I see what's going on, I do not understand why Ezra was arrested for breaching the peace and the people yelling hate and coming to intentionally agitate, provoke, and disrupt Jewish people quietly going about their lives on a Sunday in front of a building that is largely inhabited by seniors. I don't understand how that's okay. Ezra Levant taking a video of Yahya Sinwar isn't.
To be clear, I don't think Ezra should have been arrested in that context. And I believe that if police were afraid for his safety to the extent that him being there could have resulted in violence, then that is the issue that needs to be addressed, right? The people or the risk of violence, that's what has to be addressed, not arresting Ezra. The practicality of it is Ezra is one person and there is a crowd of many people. And so if it comes down to, what action are police going to take, and then you consider the context, which shouldn't be relevant, but again, we're dealing with human beings, and so it is relevant that you have this tension that exists between rebel and police. All of that contributed to the judgment call that was made. Is it one that is good for, civil liberties overall? No. And I agree with you, whether you agree or whether you appreciate or have contempt for the reporting, their style of reporting is irrelevant. This is not, I don't think, increased any level of trust or respect for police, and quite the opposite. So in making those judgment calls, was that taken into consideration? It would seem no. It would seem more that it was heat of the moment. Police have that discretion, and discretion can be a good thing. It can also be or provide cover for decisions that aren't in the best interest, right?
It is important to note that the Trudeau government has been directing huge subsidies to commercial, privately owned media in Canada, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe more. And all of this in recent years. Not surprisingly, Rebel News and several other independent media outlets are not the beneficiaries of this largesse. The government directly and heavily subsidizes most private media outlets in Canada, as well as the public broadcaster, the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which, once upon a time, was the gold standard for journalism in Canada. No longer. Think about what that does to the nature of media coverage in a country. Think about whether one may consider the media to be truly independent. Not a single mainstream media covered the Bathurst and Sheppard conflict for the year leading up to Sunday, November 24th, nor have they been present in the week since. That is what I have been told by numerous people who attend regularly. If I'm mistaken, I'd love to hear from the mainstream media that has been there. Karima, by the way, operates under the trade name of Karima Rules and is not a beneficiary of government financial support. And this is one of the many reasons that her reports are so important. The same is true, of course, for Ezra Levant's Rebel News.
Everyone should be able to exercise their civil liberties. I will stand by that statement fully. I believe in rule of law. I believe in the peace, order, and good governance. Like, those are fundamental Canadian principles. For me, that is kind of my compass, right, in driving how I perceive these events.
There's a lot of violence in words and in action. And I'm wondering, just in closing, what you have to say about that larger picture. Because, I mean, Toronto has become a very different place. People's lives have changed, and not for the better.
I think overall, we are all in greater danger of a police state, or, fewer rights to protest, fewer access to civil liberties, or the protection of civil liberties, the more that this continues, right? And the people who are driving it, in my view, are short-sighted to think that this kind of period will last forever and they'll always be able to do whatever they want. And they will also be the first ones to cry when that changes, and it will change abruptly. So from my vantage point, that's what I worry the most about, that the fatigue will cause people to say, well, screw the charter rights. Like, let's, we need to crack down on this because, and that wouldn't be an issue if the unlawful behavior, for example, blocking streets when you don't have permission to block a street, or, blockading venues, or disrupting events, or assaulting people, like all of these things are already crimes. Right? They're already crimes on the books, and they're just not being addressed. And that cumulative effect will, I think, cause a snap at some point, and we're all going to be worse off for it. So that's sort of a bleak outlook, but that is my perspective, with the benefit of 3 years of different groups, different causes, and it has only gotten more intense and more troubling.
I agree with you. I think it is pretty bleak. I think Canada is a standout nation in the worst way among Western nations. Maybe the UK every once in a while is, kind of as bad, but they're starting to turn the corner, and it'll change, dramatically when there's an election. Karima, thank you so much for taking the time. Your insight is deeply appreciated, and your work too. I think you're doing a real civic service. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.
One week after his arrest, on the morning of Sunday, December 1st, 2023, Ezra Levant was back at the corner of Bathurst and Sheppard, bright and early. He had put out notices on social media asking people to show up. Numbers. He felt it was important to have big numbers for at least 2 reasons. One is that it might give the police on the scene pause should they consider repeating the conduct from November 24th. And also, a big turnout would demonstrate to the community and the city and Canada that what happened on November 24th was not cool. Unfortunately, December 1st was a brutally cold day in Toronto. There was a good crowd that showed up, but many did not stay for long. Regardless, point made. Toronto police did not have Sergeant MacDuff return to Bathurst and Sheppard that weekend, nor has he been seen on duty there since. This concludes part 1 of this special podcast. Part 2, in which we interview journalist Brian Lilly regarding the legal issues and police conduct, will kick off the next episode. Brian has been a strong critic of police conduct since October 7, 2023, and he minces no words when addressing the way in which the pro-Hamas demonstrations have been handled. You don't want to miss him. As well, in that episode, I speak with Terry Glavin, who authored the long essay in the Free Press that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. Terry is a super seasoned journalist and author who has long taken an interest in antisemitism in Canada. Shortly after his essay was published in the Free Press, intellectual celebrity Jordan Peterson flew up to Vancouver Island, where Terry lives, to record a long discussion for his YouTube show. You can find the link in the podcast notes. As always, thanks for being here. I know, it's long. It's also really important. All eyes are on Canada these days, and for good reason. The transformation of a once great and tolerant country, quite literally overnight, still makes my head spin. If it can happen in Canada, then it can happen anywhere. Thanks again for being here. Stay tuned for part 2. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.